Today we tell a chilling tale from Martin County, Kentucky, a story of faith, family, and a tragic descent into madness and murder. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is another one of the stories of Appalachia.
Okay, Steve, we need to go and clarify this. It's not a Woody Allen movie. Doesn't have any comedy to it whatsoever.
No, none whatsoever.
No, this is a dead serious story, and I kind of came across this some time ago, and then I shared it with you, and I think we both were kind of just freaked out about the whole thing as we kind of read this story and we went on with the story.
It is a very odd story.
Mm-hmm.
But when we get into this, you'll see that you wouldn't imagine people would do the things that are in this story. But rather than tease you with this, I think we need to just jump on into the story, which begins on January the 9th, 1933, when the quiet community of Tomahawk in Kentucky was shattered by a gruesome discovery. Police, acting on neighbors' concerns, forced their way into the mountain cabin of Tom Boyd, and what they found was nothing short of horrifying. Inside, they discovered the lifeless body of 72-year-old Lucinda Mills. She'd been killed in a bizarre ritual led by her own son, John H. Mills, the 36-year-old leader of a family cult. The plan was to burn Mrs. Mills' body on an altar as a sacrifice, with the belief that she would rise from the dead 3 days later.
Oh, okay. Well, the police arrested nearly the entire Mills family, 2 daughters, 2 sons, a grandson, 2 sons-in-law, and a daughter-in-law. Tom Boyd, the cabin's owner, was held as a material witness while the rest were charged with murder. So let's take a closer look at what led up to this tragic event. According to the family, days of fasting, shouting, singing, and even dancing summoned divine commands for a human sacrifice. Initially, John Mills intended to sacrifice, well, you guessed it, 6 virgins, but ultimately chose his own mother. Okay. On February 3rd, 1933, he beat and strangled her, driven by a frenzy of religious hysteria. John Mills's behavior became increasingly erratic after his arrest. He raved and he screamed in what the cult called, quote unquote, the tongue, a hysterical gibberish. Now, he had to be chained to the bars of his cell to prevent harm to himself and, yes, even to others. And at one point, he even predicted his mother's resurrection.
Well, Rod, during his time in jail, John went on a hunger strike, only to be forcibly fed by the county health officer, Dr. W.N. Keith. Despite these interventions, he remained violent and delusional, requiring multiple men to subdue him and again chain him to cell bars. The preliminary hearing in Inez on February the 11th, 1933 was a spectacle in itself. John Mills had to be restrained on a cot during the proceedings. The defense, led by attorney Sam Maynard, argued that John's mind was temporarily unbalanced due to the fasting and the chanting. Testimony during the hearing painted a grim picture. Lucinda Mills, it was said, willingly offered her life, believing it would free her other son, Leonard, from an insane asylum. Witnesses recounted how others were considered for sacrifice but were deemed unfit when they resisted.
One particularly harrowing account came from Lucinda's daughter, married to Tom Boyd.
We got up around 11 and ate breakfast, and it wasn't long before I heard shouting down the creek and looked out the window. John Mills was coming up the holler holding a stick in front of him. His eyes were shut, and he had a Bible in his other hand. Alongside him was Ballard Mills, and he was carrying another stick and holding it just like John. They come on stumbling up the road, and I could see they were walking with their eyes shut because they stumbled over the rocks and bushes. Behind John and Ballard were their wives and Fred Mills and his wife, and about 30 or 40 kids. When I saw 'em, I was scared. I knew something was going to happen. After they got in the house, they started praying and shouting, and John went around smiting people with a stick to see if they was worthy. After a while, John said he'd been instructed by the Lord to kill 6 virgins, and they all began to look around to see who'd they pick. After they chanted a while, John said he was going to drive the devils out of our mother. She was in the other room and had a sick headache. John brought her out, and she sat down on the altar. Then John told her to lay down on the altar, and he started waving his hands and praying. The others were yelling in the tongue. Then, all of a sudden, John grabbed her throat and started to choke her. He got his knee in her chest and choked her with one hand and beat her with the other. She tried to get away, but she was too weak.
The cult's beliefs were equally disturbing. They thought John Mills could turn water into wine and grapevines into snakes. They held long religious observances, sometimes even contemplating the sacrifice of a baby from each family to save the child from sin.
Well, Lucinda Mills was buried on February 9th, 1933 in Rock House, Kentucky. Her coffin, a simple pine plank, was transported through the snow by a horse-drawn sled. Notably absent from the funeral were the family members involved in her death. At the trial, the prosecution was led by Commonwealth's attorney J.B. Clark, while John Mills was defended by Walter R. Prater. The defense hinged on claims of insanity. I guess that's about all they could do. That claim, by the way, was supported by expert testimony from Doctors W.R. Thompson and D.V. Sublett. After 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury found John Mills guilty of murder and sentenced him to life in prison. Ballard Mills and Blaine McGinnis received 21-year sentences. Molly McGinnis and Ora Moore were acquitted, and Fred Mills and Tom Boyd had been acquitted earlier by instruction of the judge.
Well, Steve, during jury deliberations, Mills could be heard screaming in his cell, probably to the top of his lungs, "The old lady will rise free of sin," and that no power on earth could judge him. As the verdict was read, though, John Mills remained eerily silent in the courtroom, his earlier outbursts replaced by a disturbing calm. Ballard Mills appeared distraught, while McGinnis declared his intent to appeal the case.
And that's where it stops, because I didn't find any other information as to what happened to these folks after this trial was over. It's like this whole thing was just shoved under the rug after that was finished. A very strange and horrible story. It's just beyond belief, really.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that gets me is you're hearing things that I guess we've kind of heard as we have, ourselves have gotten older, been around people and known things about, of course, speaking in tongues and so forth. But now this took it to a different level. This was something completely just, sacrifice and everything else. And I know there's biblical thing that goes back to the sacrifice and so forth of Abram going and sacrificing Isaac in such a way. But still, this was a family member. This was whatever had got into his head. He believed it. Or at least he was telling everybody he believed it before it was over with. And he drugged the entire family into this, and probably, I guess, for lack of a better way to explain it, ruined their lives for what was left of them after this happened.
Yeah. There was a newspaper story, though, Rod, about this preacher who had come up there to evangelize after all this had happened, and how he was being avoided as much as possible. I guess the folks up there said, "No, we don't want any more of this." But what he determined was that probably about 6 months to a year before this occurred, there was a woman preacher who came up into those hollers up around Tomahawk. and that this family just kind of gravitated toward her. And it's likely that some of these odd doctrines that they believed in was probably derived from what she had taught when she was up there.
Wow.
So there you go. The story of the Kentucky family cult that offered up, of all things, their own mother as a sacrifice. Another one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for listening. You can find the Stories podcast in a lot of places: Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Spotify, Player FM, or on your own favorite podcast app. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.